I'll just introduce myself first of all. I'm Steve Green. I'm the Chief Data and Analytics Officer for Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. We're a rather large bank, second largest bank in Japan, top 20 in the world, and most people in the UK haven't heard of us, which is fine, because neither did I. I'm kind of here just to talk about strategic advantages of kind of ubiquitous data access, but also some thoughts about how to get there and the things and the disciplines that you need to go after. So it's not just about teaching you to suck eggs as to why virtualization or logical is important. There we go. How I've kind of always thought about this when I've started in an organization, I joined the bank about 3 years ago, is start to get people to think about what the future might be like. So kind of imagine if you've got an ability to kind of understand everything about your data. Imagine if you can kind of remove those manual and frustrating processes, not just from a data sense, but actually from a business sense as well. So thinking about the end-to-end journey that you want the organization to go on. Thinking around kind of how do you make sure that everything you've got, all the intelligence you've got in your organization can be used effectively. Often that doesn't mean you want to bring it all together into a physical space, and I've tried that at various organizations historically, but actually thinking about how do you get easy access and easily understandable access to all of those users out there in the business. Ultimately, none of us will be able to hire as many data engineers and data scientists as you would like to, and therefore you've got to imagine a future that is about federated data access. It is about citizen kind of analysts. And thinking about how do you set up your environment to support that going forward in as controlled and kind of simple way as possible. And if you can do that, then your data becomes accessible, it stays secure. Ultimately, it doesn't take you 12 years to get there because you're not trying to move everything around, which is kind of the targets that people were trying to do maybe 15 years ago. And ultimately, if you can empower your organization to use data more simply, so it's easier for all people to do it, bluntly, you're using your environments to really drive improved decision making. This is not just about data because the government says so or because governance says so. It's not just about data analytics because it's cool. It's not just about AI because it's the thing to talk about. Ultimately, you're doing all of those things to drive improved business outcomes and faster decisions and better decisions. And I would argue the only way you can really do that is, in some cases, you have to remove the technical staff from the conversation. And the only way you can do that is by creating a kind of logical environment through your stack. And more complex stuff clearly requires your data scientists and your complex data engineers. But the idea has to be that as many people out there as possible are using your data lake, warehouse, fabric, mesh, whatever language might come out of Gartner this week. And so where are a lot of companies today? And we're in the same space, you know, to a degree. It's a bit of spaghetti. You've got lots of inputs coming into various tools and various systems. If you're in a larger organization, you've probably got half a dozen old school lakes. You might be starting on a lakehouse journey that has you kind of thinking about how do you bring all that together logically. But I suppose the key questions that drive me around what we're trying to achieve as a bank in this area is kind of, firstly, obviously, how do we ultimately exploit our data more effectively? Again, I would reinforce, this is not about governance for governance sake. It's not about lineage for lineage's sake. It's not about analytics for analytics' sake. It's ultimately about how do you exploit the value of your data and the value of your people across the organization as effectively as possible. Ultimately, that requires you to increase the usage of your data. And that often means it's got to be easier, both to access and to use across all the things that you do. And going forward, as people think about the ease of using some of our more complex technologies nowadays, is bringing together your house data, your functional data, but also all of the data you've got externally, sentiment analysis work, all the things that you're buying these expensive tools to be able to read properly. How do you bring that together at the front of your data stack so that people can use it in its entirety? What you don't want to do is those silos around, I use social media data, I use finance data, I use transactional data. To really get an understanding of your markets and your clients and your customers, you really need to bring all that data together and create that true single view of everything that you've got going on in your business. It's very difficult to do that without using a blend of technologies and thinking about logical views and logical models. And then really thinking about, I suppose, you've got to care about the security and control. If you bring your data together, bluntly, if you've got holes in your data handling policy or in your security tooling, you're going to find them a lot easier. because it's going to be much easier to bypass it. AI is a great tool, but if you've not locked down your document stack as well as you think you have in SharePoint or somewhere else, it's going to be a lot easier to find all those materials that you probably shouldn't be seeing. So you have to continue to think about how do you control this, again, in as easy way as possible. And I've seen some firms that do that at a real data level, you know, kind of record by record. You can see this particular department, this team, this item, but the management of that becomes dozens and dozens of security staff or admin staff. And so you have to try and make that balance around ease of access against control and governance. And then the biggest thing that certainly we're probably going to look at next is just discoverability. Is that we're in a space where we can't do change management across data really via the old processes that you would get. So whether it's using AI, whether it's using really good collection tools or kind of discovery tools, is understanding how that data is changing on a daily basis. Because you try and manage any large organization's change stack, it's going to be, what, 1,000 records a month maybe? You're going to need a very big set of data stewards to start analyzing that. And so thinking about how do you understand how your data changes so that you can trust it, so you can then allow the ease of access as much as possible. So I've nicked a couple of slides from Denodo here, who are here outside, just kind of how they see this kind of world as it evolves. So there's obviously lots of data storage and data compute kind of capabilities out there, and many of those firms are moving up this stack. So a lot of them are no longer just storage vendors. You know, there's quite a few here today. If you talk to them about their skills here, they're all kind of evolving a lot of this stuff. But what we're talking about here really is around how do you go after that ease of data discovery? How do you go after the self-service? You've got to think about your data preparation. One of the things we're talking about internally is tools like Alteryx and Tableau Prep and stuff are really good tools. But if you start using them for enterprise delivery because they're sitting on people's desktop, then there's a bunch of nervousness that certainly your IT departments will have with that work. And so how do you kind of get through that enterprise level of data engineering and kind of preparation work so that your analysts are not having to do it daily, weekly, monthly, whatever the cadence is of their activity. So thinking about what of your kind of presentation layer around your data can be done automatically on as quick a basis as possible so that when the analysts get hold of the data, they're not having to spend, I think the old stat used to be 70% of time manipulating the data. And certainly the way we're dealing with it here is having that logical view of everything that a business will need to understand. So thinking about your data domains and your subdomains, which from a governance perspective are fairly standard classifications. But then underneath that, what is your logical view of client? What is your logical view of transaction? What is your logical view of anything else you're doing in the organization? If you can put that into plain English, and there may be one logical data element sitting there with that presentation, that preparation layer, but 8, 10, 12, 20 fields underneath it representing your systems, then the ability to use that data, the ability to access it in a way that you understand and therefore can be trusted, just starts to go through the roof. It makes it so much easier for the organization to utilize the data that it's got if you move away from the physical. Obviously, data governance and security I've talked about, and then things like encryption, if you want to do kind of synthetic transaction work or synthetic data work, anonymization work, the monitoring of your services, data quality, all that kind of stuff that you can do in the right estate if you create that business data layer effectively. And then everyone can use it. And the key thing, I think, is that if you make your data easier to use, easier to access, but easier to understand by thinking about those plain English kind of logical views of your world, then the ability for different departments to use the same data becomes much easier because it's just how you talk in your business. That doesn't need to be the way the IT department developed your code. It's just about the nomenclature of the way you work as an organization. And if you get that right, then all those 5, 6 things at the top can use the same data on the same day at the same time scale, which helps you when it comes to reconciliation of your decisions. It helps if you're under a compliance industry around being able to show that your reg reporting is the same as your operational reporting. And it just makes the whole organization feel much more comfortable that when they're talking to each other, it's not just the finance report and the finance data or the ops report and the ops data. You're really building a layer which is for your organization and your enterprise, not just for team by team. And certainly historically, you know, I used to be CDO at the FCA. A lot of people would build all their regulatory reports just for regulatory reporting because they spent so long perfecting the data engineering, and then it would only be used by those departments that were sending stuff to the regulator. That cannot be the future. The cost is prohibitive. you have to be able to build these services in a way that they can be used for multiple use cases. And so I've talked through some of these. Even if you try to go with a kind of single data lake, often you've got a lot of legacy activity, a lot of databases where it's probably not worth you investing in moving them or changing them. And so I think we just have to be honest with ourselves in many organizations that one size will never fit all. And so you need to have some flexibility around that. And as I say, with us, that means we might have 8 physical data elements that are all saying the same thing, sitting in different systems, developed by different teams across different decades. And what we want to do is really represent that in a way that makes sense. It takes time and effort. You're not going to move every single one of your spreadsheets or your old SQL database into something that's amazing. It's just not going to be worth it sometimes. And so you have to kind of, again, be pragmatic about how you're going to go about building this. There are data privacy issues sometimes. I know we, in some of our global locations, not really able to move data around, even if it's to kind of safe cloud areas. And people have been trying to do some of this stuff for 30 years. And so there's a lot of vendors out there who've got kind of really good updated technology that makes this a lot easier. I think we looked at some projects 5 or 6 years ago that would have cost 50, 100 million. Now they might cost between 5 and 10 million because the quality of our IT estate is so much better. You can tell this one isn't a professional slide. This is my slide. So what we're kind of looking at really is the aim, the target here, is really to think about how do all of your end-user workplace services access your system. So making it as easy as possible to access it on a running basis. But then thinking about how those enterprise systems feed into a single, I use the phrase data hub, which is a mixture of technologies sometimes. There's a few here, a lakehouse, a semantic lakehouse, a kind of fabric, a mesh, virtualization. You need a catalog over it to understand what it is, whether that's more of a physical catalog or a business catalog. And thinking through, therefore, that once you've got that hub in place, and you'll build it out over years, you won't get it all done in 6 months, is all of those use cases should be able to use the same set of data. Now, they will not use the same view. They will not use the same kind of logical kind of data elements. But if you brought it together, those logical views for client, for instance, should be the view for client. And then if you're in finance, you have a different lens, or if you're somewhere else, you see it differently. And being able to bring it together then allows you to create a proper single view of all of the things you want to do, whether it's transaction or client or whatever, because you can bring it together kind of holistically within the data hub, and then your analysts can play around with it. Now, what that does is it makes it much simpler, as I've said before, for those analysts to get after the data, to understand it because it's in plain English. You might have a development field where it says, I don't know, field ABC, because someone didn't quite label it correctly when they built the system 10 years ago. But by creating those logical views at the front of that data hub, effectively the bit before those purple arrows, that allows pretty much everybody in your business to look at it, to look at your data catalog and your kind of data marketplace and say, I understand what that's doing. I understand which fields I need. I understand how I can use them. Now, clearly, there's modeling issues that you need to get through, but the idea is to make it as easy as possible. I think I've spoken to maybe 400 or 500 firms over the last 10 years on these subjects, and the biggest thing you get is that people are still building stuff for individual use cases too often, because that's the desperate need, that's the urgent need, that's the thing they need today. And if they spent a bit more time thinking about what it might be for tomorrow, being able to answer 57 questions, not one question, a lot of the change costs going forward start to shrink, because all of your modeling and engineering work has been done, at least to the most part. And thinking about what that ecosystem looks like allows you then to feed all of your business processes as needed, all of those kind of analytical, ad hoc queries, regulatory reporting, whatever it might be. And if you've got your data hub right with the right technologies, you can then plug in your kind of data integration activities through your service lines. So what you're not doing is lots and lots of point-to-point activity, which can be expensive. And you've got integration engines to do that as well, but the integration engines don't feed your analytics, so there's another stage there. So having to think about really how the ecosystem works, so you're distributing that data for all of your activity in your organization, I think is super important when it comes to a cost avoidance in the future, because there are so many questions you can't see today, you don't understand. And if you've got it all together, it helps with things like AI and everything else, where your data's sitting in a space that you can therefore coast across all of it, rather than just the bits that you point stuff at. And I think, as CDAO, I care about data governance. The less hops I've got, the easier it is to do that. And so by having it not go through lots and lots of different hops, lots of engineering hops through different systems, makes it a lot easier to control my data and trust it as well through the life of pretty much everything that we do. And certainly I've found recently, if you interpret things right, actually regulation can be a big help. The ECB at the moment is focusing quite heavily on BCBS 239 and thinking about how banks particularly can deal with a mixture of data governance and data analytics and decision making ultimately. The Bank of England talks a lot, the FCA talks a lot about it. A lot of people see BCBS 239 as predominantly about the data governance, and therefore people outside of your CDO and your data governance community will start to drift away from the conversation. But interestingly, if you get your access right and you get your data in one space, those bottom 5 principles of BCBS 239 are all about analytics and trust in decision making. It's about accuracy and comprehensiveness and timeliness and clarity of purpose and all that kind of stuff that you've got going on. So by designing your system well, with ease of access across plain English languages, then actually the BCBS stuff becomes easier to achieve because your lineage is simpler and bluntly, you can trust your decision making. And if you make data easier to access by your front office staff or your sales staff or whatever it might be, they will then care about data quality because they can see the value of why they should care about individual records and individual items. They will care about data governance because they can understand there's 3 steps towards a report. And if you don't understand where the data comes from, how on earth can you trust the decision that you're going to make from it? So thinking about that holistic narrative that underpins your data hub, shall we say, is super important for the organization as a whole to start to care. At the moment, what happens is you get a data governance team going and going, right, we must control, we must be safe, here's InfoSec, they'll tell you how to do that, and we must do it because the regulator says so or because I say so. And you're kind of preaching from the mount. But actually, if you get in front of those people who are ones really driving your business and saying, I can help make your decisions faster, better quality, these IT systems will deliver you that data faster than you can do today, mostly pre-engineered, so when you've got new questions, I can answer them more quickly. But most importantly, it's still compliant because my reconciliation is easier because I've got it all in one space. So certainly what we've found is by thinking differently about regulation, thinking differently about what historically started off as data governance or information security policies, by having an end-to-end conversation with your business about what it means to them when it comes to faster and more effective decision making, you really want to make your data as easily accessible as possible and in as plain a form as possible. Because then the business will understand how they got to their decisions. Too often I've sat with execs and gone, so this report here isn't quite what you think it is. The data is taken at a different time spot, the quality is a bit iffy, and actually the fields you think it are, because that's what it's called, is not the fields you think it is. And so being able to get through that conversation at a macro level is really important, and certainly don't waste those investments that you're being forced to do from a regulation perspective. Think again about answering the question of tomorrow, not just the question of today. Don't just focus on the reg report. Think about the ecosystem around that data that you're being asked to create. Think about the operations management. Think about the data quality. And then you can start to answer the other 47 questions that your business may have that's around that data. And you will spend maybe millions, maybe billions in some cases, on some of these reports. Too many firms have wasted them, and they've just put them over here in a box that says, that's my reg reporting function. And all that data exists elsewhere in the bank. It's used elsewhere in the bank. But if you've got a plain English view of your data, a simple view of your data that's logically bound, doesn't require you to move everything together, you can meet these regulatory returns while also prepping for anything that might come up in the future. And just a few minutes on kind of how I approach this when it comes to actually getting after it. Obviously, have a strategy. That strategy should not be, please govern your data. Please do analytics. Please do AI. I've seen strategies that literally are, please do AI. Think about how do you engage your business? How do you get people excited in your strategy? How do you get them to support it? You've got to talk business language. So strengthen our governance, risk and control environment, not just in data governance, but for risk and for compliance generally. Think about the outcomes you're trying to achieve for the organization as a whole. Sustainability, big thing in finance at the moment. We're working through the sustainability stuff. Simplification, streamline, automate, make your engineering simpler. Again, if you can do this right the first time by thinking a bit harder about it, it becomes a lot easier to answer all of the other business problems that you may have. And then obviously growth. So again, as a CDAO, my job is not just to govern the data or to build an analytics team. My job is to make the business make better decisions, so they grow better, so they're more efficient, so they're more effective. And certainly when I started the job, I took 2 days talking to the COO about, do you want me to do this stuff, or do you want me to do the data governance stuff and write a policy and a framework, and thank you very much? Because if it's that, I'm not interested. So by creating a strategy and an ecosystem that relies upon ease of access and ease of control around your data and simple language around your data, you can deliver those outcomes and you can get business people to care deeply about your strategy. Thinking about those business outcomes, not just the tasks or the deliverables that you have to achieve as a data individual. And so this is kind of my team at the SMBC. FCA, sorry, I say that occasionally still, after 3 years. So we have a data strategy team, stakeholder management, business change, communications, and really thinking about how do we move forward the narrative for the organisation around data. It isn't just about doing the data stuff, because you've got to win people over. You've got to persuade them it's the right thing to do. And you've got to engage with those business units about how you can make their life easier. And a couple of my data strategy team are here today. So Dave Holland's here and Neil's here. Data governance, obviously the basics. Doing data governance, understanding your data. If you don't understand it, if you don't know where it is, how on earth do you trust it? And therefore, how on earth do you trust your decisions? Data governance, data quality, data management. We have an innovation team thinking about new ways of using our data, new technologies with IT, providing simple bits of advice to citizen analysts across the organisation, a bit of T-shaped individuals who don't have a very specific kind of data role. Their job is just to guide people on how to be better at using our data. Information governance. So as AI becomes more important, as your records become easier to understand and access, the disciplines around records management will become similar to those around data governance. And so bringing together your unstructured and your structured data teams actually has been a real boon for us, particularly when we think about the privacy and the data handling concerns that AI might drive going forward. So we're able to have those conversations centrally rather than scattered through 3 or 4 different departments. Data migration, often sitting in IT, but actually the profiling work, the trust work, the data ownership, the testing work, the sign-off work is all data governance activity. And so we have the data migration team in here, and they send stuff to IT for them to script and do and stuff like that, as you'd expect. And then obviously analytics and data science. So how do we take that forward? But it's underpinned by this narrative, as I say, across those outcomes, which are everything these teams do must matter to the business. Not just matter to me or matter to the CIO or matter to my teams themselves. It must be driven by those business outcomes we're trying to achieve. And then obviously supported by the IT stack, the data and analytics technologies, our change management group, business change, process re-engineering, BAs, all that kind of stuff. And then kind of transformation team more broadly. What are the big things, the big outcomes the organization's trying to get to? And I would just kind of reinforce again, if you're trying to drive real business change, you don't do that by trying to educate people about your physical data layer or telling them exactly how your data sets are built or how they're structured. You get that by talking in a logical language that people can understand. And you then, the classic swan legs under the water, you're doing lots of work underneath to make that as simple as possible. But they know that if they pick client address 1, it's got all the client address ones that are relevant for their query. And it doesn't matter whether that's called field ABC or field 234 or client address ZYX or whatever it might be within the systems that you've got underneath it. And then finally, we have translated those outcomes into a high-level roadmap. And that roadmap is backed by dozens and dozens of deliverables scattered across dozens of projects and programs. So we have a very large ecosystem of change work. But I have checked this. This is generic enough to be okay to share. And so we have kind of 3 top-level outcomes. What are we really trying to achieve at a macro level for governance, for sustainability, for our cultural change, for the simplification of our business processing, and obviously, ultimately, for the growth of our business? And so thinking about how do we play those out, again, in business terms, we had a really good session with some of our front office SLT who bluntly really don't care about data governance. But what they really did is go, okay, we will help you build a language that resonates with our staff, because they never ever think about data governance. They never really think about data analytics either. And so trying to get you to a situation where you have built those bonds with the stakeholders so they will help you reflect your message back to their teams in a way that makes sense. I always say to people that I spend a lot of time shaking hands when I join a job and saying hello before I need people. So before I know I'm going to need them, before I know what their skills and strengths are, I will generally go say hello to a lot of people. And then when I do need them, it's not just because I'm saying hello because I need something. And that makes quite a big difference around stakeholder management and getting out there and really getting the organisation bought into the way you want to work. And then final slide. What does that mean from a delivery model perspective? The kind of things you need to get after to achieve all of that stuff. This started off as an ease of access conversation. Think about your platforms, obviously. There's lots of technology stacks out there available, both on the cloud systems and outside of it. You need to think about your office estate. So what are you doing with SharePoint? What are you doing with your Power Apps? All of those things are important to leverage your strategy effectively. What are the toolings and products? There are many out here today, and I think after this I'll be at the Denodo stand for half an hour or so. Thinking about how do you go after those platform products, all of them. What are you going to do to get after them? It can't just be an IT conversation to say, we are going to bring in this technology because it's cool. It's got to be about, and so what? What are we going to do with it? Data management, I've talked about it. Really important around the data management stack, obviously. And importantly, you're drifting into analytics governance as well. So what's the ethical use of AI? What's the kind of logical modeling plans that you've got? How do you go about trusting your decisions in all of those analytics and data science and AI products that you're building? And data architecture becomes really important. You have a world now where you've got to try and explain all of this physical world into a place that makes sense to people. And if you've got, generative AI capabilities that are built predominantly on kind of plain English querying, it makes those more effective as well if you've mapped everything and labeled everything in a way that makes sense. And often that can be done by other AI tools. And so thinking about how you build that ecosystem end to end is really important. The operating model, what's in your data office, what's not, how do you deal with hub and spokes in the business? You're never going to centralize everything. I would suggest you don't try. Centralization works really well for the first 2 or 3 years, and then people start to leave, and they forget what they did when they were in the departments. You find it difficult to replace them, and that makes it really difficult then to start to understand their language and their work that they did in that department. So the hub and spoke model certainly seems to work wherever I've gone. But again, plain English makes it easier to do that, because it makes it easier for slightly less trained individuals to understand your estate and the data that you've got. And then don't shy away from the culture comms training conversation. Don't leave it in other people's hands. You need to understand how your audience is going to talk, how they're going to understand what you're going after. They need to be able to understand you back. I think the average life of a CDO, they say, is 2 years. I suspect a lot of that is failure of communication rather than anything else. It's not because they're bad at their jobs. It's not because the data doesn't exist anymore. It's rubbish. It's predominantly a failure of change management and communications and expectation setting. And then finally, none of it matters, ultimately. We can do all the cool stuff. You can buy all the gear. And if it doesn't make any difference to your business, you don't change the way you exploit your data, you don't change the effectiveness of those decisions or the speed of the decisions, then ultimately it doesn't matter at all. You can all go home because there's no salaries or paying for the tools that you've got out there. So always focus on what are you trying to achieve? Some of your boundaries will be set by regulators or set by internal controls or whatever it might be, but always try and keep your eye on the outcomes that you're trying to go after, because that is what will drive value. And ultimately, that's why people will want to invest in you over the next 3 or 4 years, not just the first year you turn up with a good idea. I think I'm done. Thank you all very much.